get started. When I looked at the topic, I sort of asked the same question I think everybody else asked, was, what's it all about and what does it mean? And I wanted to really sort of start the process by thinking, I think it's a pretty crappy title, quite frankly, because I just don't know what, dealing with the issue of happiness. What I thought was missing from today's agenda, and this gives me an excuse for coming here and talking about it, is talking about what we mean by good society. So I want to sort of translate the whole issue of happiness into the idea of good society, basically. And I think David and I were having a bit of a disagreement about that, because I just don't think happiness is I think happiness is a byproduct of how you live. I don't think it's something you can actually address individually. And if you do try and address it individually, you end up with a fairly sort of tacky thing, like you have happiness conferences, happiness pills, happiness formulas, and assorted other stuff. And it often relates back to the idea of material goods and material happiness, and then you get arguments about whether you can get happier with material goods or happier with the other non-material goods and get around that. So what I want to do, and I confess I'm a sociologist, so I tend to see things in social forms, is to actually start looking at the fact that what really counts, I think, for all of us, in terms of whether we are content, if you like, with our lives, is what our relationships is with others, how we fit into a broader society. Human beings are social beings. My biggest gripe with the current neoliberal stuff is that it completely ignores that. It assumes it's something that only can come out of a fairly masculinized form of philosophy. It assumes that people are self-interested individuals and contained in the sense that they do things out of individual self-interest, which completely ignores the fact that human beings are actually socially connected beings, and we are actually literally connected, and that's why I think it's a bit of a gender issue, because women know we're literally connected, because we have babies, some of us have babies. And, we're interdependent. We need other people, we need to be part of a social thing, we're part of a tribe, we're part of a group. And we're not comfortable when we're on our own. Some of us might be individually, but that might be something else that we're doing. So when we start talking about happiness, what we need to do, I think, is talk about the good society, and how we actually create a good society. And this is an item which is not actually on the agenda of any parties. I've tried very hard to raise it amongst the Greens at various stages. As a unifying idea, what we do is want to put bits and pieces together in a way that says, this is what makes a good society, these are the sorts of policies, this is the role of government. Now, the role of government is limited, but what do governments do that encourage good relationships, that encourage a sense of meaning, that encourage people, to be able to be seen that they're accepted and that they're part of a group, that they're actually engaged with things, that they can contribute, and that if they have needs, they're going to be taken care of. That, I think, is one of the roles that government should be taking on, and that's one of the areas that we, as policy advocates, which is where I would put myself, need to try and make sure they do. And in the current situation, that's not what's happening. We actually have policies like some of the stuff we have around security, around some of the stuff we have around policing, some of the stuff we have around income support. This crappy stuff we've got about income management in the Northern Territory. And 2 weeks ago, with the support of the Labour Party, the Greens were the only group that actually were very good on this one, which is the idea of the plastic the welfare card, cashless welfare card, which has been brought in, which is going to infiltrate the entire welfare system. And most people have just ignored it, and the Labour Party voted for it. So, these are the sorts of things which create serious divides when you start treating part of the population as though they're infantile fuckwits, rather than recognising that people have the capacity to make their own decisions, that they need a sense of agency. If you go back to the World Health Organization stuff about the social determinants of health, if you look through them, maybe 40, 50 years ago, various bugs and diseases would have been, part of what was really the problem. But the main problem we have now is a reaction to our social environment. It is because of what we do things, they're like what they call lifestyle things, but they assume that we are individuals who can make decisions about stopping eating things like chocolate cake and various other things, versus the fact that if you take a look at the populations, if you look at issues like inequality, and this is the work that people like Michael Marmot and other people have done, that the more unequal things are, the lower your life chances are, the earlier you tend to die, and the less able you are to see yourself as a person that can actually keep, has any capacity to influence what happens in your life, any sense of agency. So the issue about sense of agency is an extraordinarily important one. And it's one of the parts that actually, I think, defeat the idea of dealing with happiness as an individual thing, because a sense of agency is about you being seen by others as having power and seeing yourself as having some sort of power, of being a person that has some control over your life. But you can't have control over your life if it's not part of a set of relationships, unless you really want to go and be a hermit in the woods, and that's already not probably what most of us want to do. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is we need to start talking about what looks like a good society, which gives people the best chance of enjoyment, pleasure, whatever you want to call it, in their lives. And they're going to have lives that are days up and days down, and various other things, frustrations, the weather, people, whatever it is. But we need to have the sorts of infrastructure, political, economic and social infrastructure, which limits the way that we structurally distribute inequalities and problems. And that's what I think we need to talk about. And that's part, Joe, you can report this to whoever put up the agenda, is missing from today's agenda. So that's what I thought when I was asked to talk, we can maybe put it onto the agenda so we can talk about the sorts of societies that we do. And it's getting back to the idea, and this is something I'd be interested in people's feedback, that I think is actually very prevalent at the moment, is the fact that most people don't see social change as very possible. We have a lot of people who are very uncomfortable and angry about what happens. There's a very high degree of protest and anger about what's happening. But when you sit down and say, okay, what's the alternative? People look at you slightly bemused as if to say, what are you talking about? Why would I actually be able to say anything about that? So you get the situation where trying to create the idea of where we want to go has actually fallen off the agenda. And I'm old enough to remember the 70s very clearly, in fact the 60s, and even the 50s comes down to that. What we had, and there's a few people around the room that probably do remember those things there, what you had after the Second World War was a strong sense of optimism. Don't ask me why, because there was no real reason why we should be more optimistic then than now. We had the Cold War coming upon us, we had the invention of the atom bomb and its various antecedents, we had all sorts of possibilities, we actually had in the 1960s and 70s, various terrorist groups, all sorts of things, we had various wars, we had all sorts of things that potentially are very similar to what we've got now. But those of us that grew up in that time had a very firm conviction that change was possible, and that in fact, if we got involved in things, it became inevitable. And after the Second World War, we actually got a major intervention by governments in terms of the fact that the welfare state, which was introduced in most Western industrialised countries, including Australia, with various people, Nugget Coombs and various people in Australia introducing healthcare, university, welfare payments and various other things. In the 1960s and into the 70s, that was followed by social movements where people actually started doing things about race, sex, gender, various other sorts of issues, with a strong feeling that we could do something about it, that it was possible to do something about it, a strong feeling of optimism. And I think that's missing. Talking to younger people these days, I don't think there's a sense of optimism. I tried to start something a few years ago about talking about the future and trying to organise informal focus groups via a dinner party process. And whenever we tried to get into action, nobody would talk about it. We can't talk about the future. I couldn't find people who wanted to talk about it. It was too hard. And I checked with somebody who ran focus groups for Ipsos, and she found the same problem with some of the things that they had. People find it very difficult to project into the future without looking at a dystopian view, about gloom, doom and disaster. Now, I know we've got environmental problems, but I also think we will solve the environmental problems if we can get some optimism and trust and goodwill into the population, as well as trying to scare the shit out of people, at which stage they just pull the doonas over their heads. So I think we need to go back to looking at how do we put together a utopian future, how do we put back a vision of what we want. We'll get political action when people can join us in seeing that this is something that we can achieve things on. we lose ground when we only scare people, and I think that that's what's happening at the moment, or we only have protest. It's got an empty, and I found a really nice quote I dug up, which I'd never seen at one stage, by Oscar Wilde. A map of the world that doesn't include utopia is not worth even glancing at, because it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and, seeing a better country, sets sail. Progress is the realisation of utopias. And I think we need to actually remember that. But in a sense, that optimism, the sense that there's always another country, always something better to go to, is the things that drives progress. And at the moment, I think we're very unprogressive. Sometimes it's hard to find the difference between conservatives and small C's, and some of these some of the more radical groups, as we try and hang on to those things we want to hang on to, but don't put up the alternatives. So I'm going to sort of finish this off, because I'd like to get some broad discussion with it, with saying I think the challenge of creating a state in which people have greater levels of capacity for contentment, happiness, whatever you want to call it, and I object to the happiness because I do think it's individuated and not social, that we need a situation where we can encourage people to feel that they belong, to feel that their lives are important, to feel that they're heard, to feel that they've got meaning in their lives, that they can contribute, as well as take things, that they are connected, that they're valued, that they're respected. These are all social things, and have a sense of well-being because of that, what happens. Where conflict is actually seen as a way of achieving things because we do it respectfully, rather than something that we have to avoid. And inclusion is again important, as long as it's not inclusion on the basis that you've got to look like us and talk like us and be like us. We need to be able to set up societies where we trust strangers. Any of you that remember my Boyer lectures, which are now 20 years ago, and the idea of social capital and the currency of society is trust of other people, trust of institutions and trust of other people. And at the moment in Australia, they're very low. We need to build the trust, and we need to build trustworthy institutions. And we don't do that just by tearing down what we have without looking at what we can replace them with, and having a sense that replacement is possible and the future can be brighter than the present thing. We need to go back to, I think, the chiefly idea of a light on the hill. Because if you get a light on the hill, you keep moving onwards. If you don't, you fall down and into the mire and you get stuck. And I think that a lot of the groups are stuck. I think the Greens are trying to do some interesting things, but they don't have a connected narrative which says, this is where we want to go, this is how we put it together, this is how we get there, and this is how all the bits and pieces fit into it. And until you get that, it's very hard to get the levels of support that you want to try and do things, because negativity unfortunately turns a lot of people off if that's the only thing that you're doing is saying what's wrong with the system. So we need to set something up, and I'm just setting up something called the Good Society Network. If people want to put up good social policies, talk to me afterwards. That we can actually start thinking about the gaps in the system, what's wrong with the system, what's not there because you've got bipartisan policies, and how we actually develop the agenda for a good society so that we can go out there and say, hey, it's worthwhile looking at the future because we can make it a better one than we've got at the moment. And I think I'll stop at that point.
Thank you.